Africa and South Africa particularly is a fantastic place for renewables, especially solar. I mean, we've got a lot of sun here in South Africa. We've got extremely high solar density, so it's really a fantastic place to deploy solar on a very large scale, on a utility scale. And that's actually one of the most critical things we need to do as soon as possible is get our utilities as clean as possible. Because again, South Africa being quite a resource rich country has relied a lot on coal power for our energy.
Got my coffee and today's guest here with me, so we're ready to roll. Welcome to the Circular Coffee Break podcast, where we will be casually talking about everything circular and beyond. My guest today is Michael Maas, CEO of Zimi. And Zimi provides comprehensive EV charging solutions tailored for commercial fleets, offering integrated hardware and software to manage charging infrastructure and track energy consumption, and actually support sustainability efforts. Zimi operates out of Stellenbosch in South Africa, and I'm really looking forward to talk with Michael today about the development of sustainability and more specifically the electrification of mobility in Africa and beyond. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you. And as said, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. But maybe to get us started, could you maybe introduce yourself, your background a little bit, what you're doing at Zimi and the work you're actually looking at?
Definitely. So, yeah, thanks so much for having me, Michael. My background really started as an engineer. So, I studied engineering, mechatronics, focusing on the interface between hardware and software, and started working as a product manager. So, I worked for a number of years in product management, specifically in building IoT solutions. So, working with large engineering teams in new product development. And then a couple of years ago, I started Zimi Charge. So founded it with my co-founder, Stefan now. He's also an engineer. And we really just saw an opportunity in the South African market where nobody was addressing the really big infrastructure challenges that are faced when looking to switch to electric vehicles. So Zimi was really founded from the idea that if you want to switch to electric vehicles, one of the key components is energy. It's a completely different way of thinking about energy. It's a completely different way of accessing energy. And existing fleet managers, home users, anybody who's looking to switch to an electric vehicle is going to face that challenge. So we took it upon ourselves to see what we can do with our background in engineering and in product management to really solve this problem in the South African context. So Zimi is focused on a number of things. I think you gave quite a good overview, but really focused on two main components. One is the hardware. So we build electric vehicle charging stations here. We then also install them, so at any location for our customers. And then we manage and operate them with the assistance and help of our data and software systems. So we work primarily with commercial fleets. So thinking of fleets in logistics, in field services, corporate fleets, and we're busy expanding to home users as well. So we work with a number of fleets and really help them to firstly make the transition, to understand what it takes to transition, and then to deploy and operate their infrastructure for them.
Cool, interesting, and I think what you mentioned, the EV infrastructure is a huge problem around the globe, as it needs to be built up very rapidly in order to enable and accelerate the electrification of mobility. In that context, can you share maybe some of your insights on the current developments in EV charging infrastructure on the African continent, specifically in South Africa, and some of the challenges and opportunities you see in the sector that you've come across in your work at Zimi?
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe taking a step back to looking at what's the outlook of EV adoption globally is a good starting point. So if you look at global EV adoption, you're seeing a big rise in sales and adoption in China, in Europe, and America. That's about 95% of the global EV market currently. The entire rest of the world only compromises about 5%. So the rest of the world is really lagging the European, American, and Asian nations. What's quite interesting is that In Africa, though, even though we're a bit behind, the adoption is starting to increase quite rapidly. You're starting to see a lot of climate consciousness being driven by businesses, really focused on how can we explore decarbonizing our organizations, how can we decarbonize our fleets, and they're really starting to think about what is the best way forward for these types of operational models and vehicle models. So what's quite interesting is that if you look at the African continent, also very large, many countries, different challenges in Africa, right? In Africa, for example, we have lots of challenges with energy stability and grid stability. South Africa specifically has been facing a lot of challenges with just the availability of electricity for all businesses, for all forms of life. So not only for mobility. That has actually led to quite a lot of innovation and quite a lot of progress on solar uptake in South Africa, which has been a fantastic starting point. I think it's one of the rare places where if you go and talk to a commercial customer, they'll actually know the specifications of a solar PV system. They'll know what an inverter is. They'll know how batteries work because they've had to solve this for their businesses, which makes the conversation around EVs and EV charging and infrastructure so much better because it's quite engaging. And in a lot of cases, the companies have actually started oversupplying electricity, right? So they've gone, they've been quite risk averse. They've installed a lot of solar. Now they have too much solar. And in South Africa, we don't have such a very well developed exchange or platform from where you can actually resell electricity back to the grid. So now they have excess supply and they don't know what to do with it. And that's actually also driving a lot of adoption. So we've got interesting challenges on the African continent, but if you're thinking of charging stations in South Africa, I think we've just crossed about 500 public charging stations in South Africa. We've got about 3,000 electric vehicles on the roads out of a fleet of 12 million. The growth is looking to cross about 10% adoption by 2030. So that's about 1.2 million vehicles that have to get onto the roads. And of course, for every one of those vehicles, we need to think about the energy, where it's coming from, and then for us as Zimi, also the infrastructure part of that.
Very interesting. And I recently read an article that in many areas, Africa has the possibility to jump some of these technological developments that we've seen in other parts of the world and go directly to renewable energy, to electrified solutions in that context, which is exactly reflecting what you said. I mean, this jump out of the necessity towards these sustainable solutions is naturally a great accelerator and a great motivator to go into that direction. How do you perceive the broader development of sustainability in Africa? We now talked about EV charging, the electrification and the background there, but how do you see the broader sustainability agenda in South Africa and Africa more broadly? And what role do you see for Zimi in promoting these sustainability practices across the continent and beyond?
Africa is such an interesting place because I think we are quite early in the stage of industrialization across many nations. So a lot of African nations are still developing their economies. But I think what people sometimes forget is that we've just seen this massive boom in Southeast Asia in the past 20 or 30 years. That is the next 20 or 30 years in Africa. Africa is on an amazing growth path. What that means for climate is that we can develop our industries to be more sustainable. We can, for example, use renewable energy in ways that actually gives us access to energy, and that we build our industries with that at the front of mind, right? So it can be quite a foundational consideration, which is quite exciting. Africa and South Africa particularly is a fantastic place for renewables, especially solar. I mean, we've got a lot of sun here in South Africa. We've got extremely high solar density. So it's really a fantastic place to deploy solar on a very large scale, on a utility scale. And that's actually one of the most critical things we need to do as soon as possible, is get our utilities as clean as possible. Because again, South Africa being quite a resource-rich country has relied a lot on coal power for our energy. So I do think that there's quite an interesting and also very exciting roadmap for Africa going forward, especially if we can think about our energy systems in a way where we focus on renewables and build from the ground up with that front of mind. In terms of what we're doing at Zimi, we're obviously very interested in electric vehicles and in mobility. we work with a number of organizations, and I think in logistics again, a lot of the places where they're charging is at their warehouses, it's at their distribution centers, it's places where they either already have solar or have set up solar in some way or form. So we're always thinking about the energy part of the equation as well, and how to balance that, how to track that, etc. And I do think, even though we're just in South Africa now, we do have ambitions to scale globally. And I think Africa, especially East Africa, are really interesting markets for us. So I think we'll keep pushing our tech into other African markets and just making it as easy as possible for people to access electric vehicle charging infrastructure.
That's great, and we just recently had an episode with CAP-A, the Climate Action Platform Africa, and there we talked about exactly what you just mentioned: this potential that Africa has to become actually a solution to the global climate problem, with resources, with people, with basically jumping these development paths and really offering solutions to the rest of the world that will actually help us in addressing some of the challenges, some of the problems that we're seeing at the moment. Now, you mentioned earlier that you're looking both at the commercial side, basically the fleets, but also like private house owners and private persons. How do you see the adoption of EV, of electrified mobility in these areas? Is both picking up at the same time, or do you see companies and the commercial side being ahead of like the private car owner or the private house owner?
They're definitely two very different markets, and the way in which these, let's call it customer bases or areas develop is completely different because they have different considerations. So when you talk to a commercial fleet owner, they are more risk averse because they have to make quite a substantial shift. They manage, let's say, anything from 500 to 5,000 vehicles in their fleet. So for them, it's about thinking, how are they going to transition? How are they going to manage a hybrid fleet, so both electric and fuel, and make the shift gradually? And they also have to look at various options. They have to consider various vehicle options. They have to consider what's available in the market, etc. So it's a different type of decision making. Consumers is quite exciting because, again, in South Africa, we're seeing lots of vehicles being launched in the market. We've recently had Volvo have a lot of success in the market, where they're the biggest seller. So I think half of EV sales at the moment are Volvos in South Africa. South Africa is also an interesting macroeconomic landscape in Africa because we're the most industrialized country in Africa, and we have quite a high income segment in our higher income bracket. So you are seeing adoption of these vehicles. Again, having more vehicle options available would be quite important for the consumer market to continue growing. Also, in terms of the cost or the price difference, they are quite expensive still compared to ICE vehicles. And in countries like the Netherlands and Scandinavian countries, the incentives really were one of the key things that helped bring that price to parity. That's such an important thing for consumers. So you are seeing adoption in the space. You are seeing consumers taking on the, let's call it, the inherent risk of new technology, early adopters, and you are starting to see a lot more EVs on the roads, which is fantastic. I do think, however, that in South Africa the fleet landscape is going to grow faster. I think, again, because there's a bigger incentive in terms of cost savings, in terms of carbon reduction, although consumer vehicle adoption has been a bit faster at this stage.
Interesting. No, I think you're seeing something similar in other parts of the world, in that context as well. How do you see? Because in Europe we very often talk about like the reach of EV vehicles and how not only your own infrastructure, like your charging station at your house or your logistics center, is important, but it's also important to have a broader infrastructure where you can charge your EV. How do you see that in South Africa? Is that developing? Is there's a lot of investment into the broader charging infrastructure? And how is that actually impacting decisions by companies, by individuals to go for EVs?
Yes, so most of the public infrastructure is being driven by private companies. So private companies launching networks, automotive companies launching networks in South Africa. There's a lot of private funding in this space. I do see, however, that there's quite a lack of infrastructure on the national routes. So if you're thinking of a logistics operator, they have, either last mile, mid mile, or other forms of distribution that they're doing. So if they need to go a longer distance, more than 200 kilometers, then it becomes a problem if they don't have access to infrastructure on the public routes, on the public highways. So I do think that in the next 5 to 10 years, we should see a lot of development in that space. I know the government has started putting down some investment in these areas, but primarily it's driven by the private entities.
And interesting. And you mentioned the automotive OEMs, the car manufacturers, and their role in basically driving this change, this transition. How do you see their approach at the moment in basically enabling this shift towards the electrification of mobility, but also basically ensuring a sustainable, long-term efficient change towards that direction that really supports local companies, local businesses in making that step going forward, but also, as you mentioned, providing these cost-efficient options for private households, for individuals to basically switch towards EVs.
Yes, the automotive makers have such a large role to play, because if you think of our solution, the vehicles are really the hardware that we're charging. So without the vehicles, we're stuck. We have a very strong vehicle manufacturing sector in South Africa. So we export a lot of vehicles to places like Europe. And what's becoming quite important and prioritized by government is protecting those industries. And what's happening with, for example, the European regulations coming in for things like ICE vehicle sales bans, we're having to shift our manufacturing, pivot that quite quickly into electric vehicles. Otherwise, we're going to be losing quite a large sector of our economy, which is critical. So we are seeing investment incentives for EV manufacturers. So things like tax rebates for OEMs, which is fantastic. It's starting now in the next couple of years. We're starting to see some vehicle companies really leading. So, for example, Volvo, BMW, Audi, they're really pushing out a lot of vehicles into the market, albeit in the luxury segment. It's just the start. I can see the new vehicle models coming out year by year. So it's quite exciting to see that development. I do think, however, that if you're thinking of vehicle imports versus exports, a locally produced vehicle is always going to lead to a higher uptake. So if you think of countries like Thailand and in China especially, you have an extremely strong local demand driven by an extremely strong local manufacturing sector of EVs. And in South Africa specifically, we haven't been able to produce as many electric vehicles, but we have been doing that in the micro-mobility space. So electric bikes, motorbikes, three-wheelers. We do have a lot of innovative entrepreneurs pushing that segment. And those are mainly using last mile delivery, so food, grocery delivery spaces. So there we're seeing some exciting adoption. But in terms of consumer vehicles, we are very reliant on the automakers. But hopefully with the investment incentives, they will bring in more models and release more models in country and also drive down cost.
Okay, interesting. And I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, Zimi Charge was founded in 2021, so some years back. What were some of the learnings along the way that maybe also companies, organizations around the world can learn from how to approach the electrification of your fleet? I mean, what are typically the steps you see companies take in order to make this a successful transition? Because as you said, I mean, there's a lot of things you have to consider. It's not only the investment into new vehicles, into new cars, but it's also how you manage them and so on and so forth. So how have you seen companies make that transition successful and really also get back the benefits that the companies are looking for in the sense of being more sustainable, impacting their CO2 footprint, but also they might be looking at cost reductions, efficiency gains, and so on.
Definitely. I can speak from the perspective of a fleet operator or a fleet manager. They look at one very key metric when looking at cost, and that's cost per kilometer. So cost per kilometer for a vehicle on the road. And that includes everything. That's the vehicle's price or depreciation. That's the fuel, the maintenance, repairs, tires, the tracking system, etc. That all gets simplified into one metric. How much is that costing? How many euros or rands or dollars is that costing per kilometer? So if you look at the main constituents of that cost, right, it's the biggest ones are the vehicle depreciation and energy. What's really interesting about electric vehicles is that the energy is significantly lower than in comparison to fuel or petrol. But in certain cases, depending on the vehicle brand and on the vehicle cost, the depreciation will be significantly higher. So if you look at, for example, fleet operators buying certain vehicle brands, they'll depreciate them down to, let's say, 40%. Others will write them off in the same time period. So that makes a big difference if you're looking at your cost per kilometer for a vehicle. So there's something interesting where the fleet operators and managers are not necessarily as familiar with how to do the cost comparison with electricity. Again, it's a completely different form of energy.
Yeah.
The units are different. There's a lot of ways in which you can optimize energy as well for certain tariff schedules, etc. So what we typically do is when we work with fleet managers, we start with data analysis. That's really the best starting point. Looking at your existing data from your locations, from your vehicles, from your telematics systems to understand what your routes look like and what your fleet looks like. From there, we can give you really good detail as to where would be a good starting point, because it's not always good to just transition your entire fleet. But there could be certain routes, there could be certain segments which are actually perfect, especially if you have to match them with the vehicles that are available in the South African market. We have a significantly lower amount of, I think we only have about 30 vehicles, electric vehicle models available in South Africa. So we are quite specific about what can be used successfully for a fleet. I must say also what's interesting is that a lot of fleets are very innovative. This is quite an innovative space for them as well. So a lot of fleets are willing to test things and to trial things. And I think there's a lot of options available to run pilots, to run test cases with automotive manufacturers. So I think again, one of the learnings is that it might seem like this big daunting task, shifting your entire fleet to electric, but it can be very simple if you A, start with data, and B, engage with the automotive makers to test them out.
Yeah, I think it's very often the case, isn't it? If you start small, if you start experimenting, start learning along the way, that's normally the way to go. And also to get people on board, to have the first positive experience, show the first results, then it's much easier to scale and basically expand to the full fleet and into other areas. Now, the coffee is unfortunately empty, and it's time to wrap up this episode. But I mean, before I let you go, one final question. I mean, looking ahead into the future, let's assume we have a crystal ball. What are your thoughts on the future trajectory of EV charging and sustainability initiatives in South Africa and more broadly in Africa over, let's say, the next decade? And how will you play a role with your work, but also how do you see other stakeholders play a role in this context?
I think the future is extremely bright. I think there's a very strong growth in this segment, specifically from the appetite from customers, from commercial entities that really are looking for innovative ways in which to reduce their carbon footprint. So that for me is just the first thing. I think there's an extremely bright future for electric vehicles in South Africa. I think in terms of infrastructure as well, I think we're going to have to roll out a significant amount of charging stations, as will Europe, as will America, as will Asia. So I think there's still a lot of space for deploying infrastructure. And I think that when we pair these things with really renewable energy solutions, so either on-site solar or wheeled or traded energy, there's a lot of space in which we can think about e-mobility as a really sustainable solution. I think across Africa, it's also going to be interesting, especially when looking at the vehicle types. I think in East Africa, for example, two-wheeler adoption has been fantastic. I think we're going to see similar types of changes in their consumer market, in their commercial market, in the logistics spaces, etc. So I definitely believe that Africa will definitely lead the future of renewable energy. In electric vehicles, we might be a couple of years behind, but we'll hopefully surpass the rest of the world soon.
That's a great outlook, and I agree. I think Africa has the potential of really jumping the curve here and really accelerating and taking a lot of actions faster and accelerated compared to other markets in that context. It's all, I guess, a question about the investments, the right focus, all the different stakeholders pulling in the right direction. Thanks a lot, Michael, for joining me today. It was a pleasure and great to hear your insights and ideas on EV charging in South Africa as well as sustainability.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. For all of you listening out there, as always, we hope the episode today gave you a new perspective, a new insight, a new idea on how sustainability, how circularity is developing, can be developed, and maybe something you can incorporate into your daily pursuit of circularity and sustainability. We're very thankful for all of you listening and joining the Circular Coffee Break community. If you want to help us expand that, feel free to basically share the podcast, share the episodes with your friends, with your family, with people that you feel could be interested or benefit from the insights that our fantastic guests are sharing here. New episodes, as I'm sure many of you know, drop every 2 weeks, and we have a lot of interesting guests lined up for the coming months in the future. The only thing left for me is to thank you for listening today, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you here on the Circular Coffee Break podcast.